Good afternoon. We are here with Graham Hillier to continue our conversation about translation of research in the UK. Good afternoon, Graham.
Hello, Cindy.
Graham, would you be able to tell us a little bit about your background and your incredible journey thus far?
I'll do my best, yeah. Whether it's incredible or not is open to debate, I think. So I'm Graham Hillier, and my current role is as Strategy and Futures Director at an innovation services organisation called the Centre for Process Innovation, which is also part of the UK's High Value Manufacturing Catapult. But just to give you some feeling for my journey, I started off at Rolls-Royce in the early 1980s and was sponsored through university by them. And I also did my PhD for them on the deformation mechanisms and defect energies in single crystal superalloys. So lots of deep transmission electron microscopy and crystallography. Following that, I joined what was then ICI, and I worked in their plastic films businesses, where in the early 80s I had a job about the circular economy, actually, about how to improve the first pass efficiency and the raw material efficiency of a plant that made polymer films for all sorts of different applications. And we managed to get our raw material efficiency up to about 95% and our first pass efficiency up to 60%, which not far off increased the capacity of our plant by 25% just by operating it super efficiently. I think that's something that stuck with me for ever since, actually. I then worked for ICI Advanced Materials business, where I worked on PES and PEEK polymers. PEEK polymer became what's now called Victrex, and we did a lot of replacement of metals with polymers in things like impellers for central heating pumps and those kinds of things. My next big role in what was still ICI was in their petrochemicals, plastics and fertilizers business, where I was the planning and strategy director for the whole business. We looked at how all our different plants operated, how they integrated with one another, what they should be making on a day-to-day basis and a year-to-year basis. And I was in that role at the point that ICI decided that it was going to exit its main commodity chemicals businesses, and those businesses were sold. I then moved to what was then British Steel, the original British Steel, rather than the current one, where I worked in business development and the development of new ventures for British Steel. Once we merged with Hoogevens, the Dutch steel company at the time, to create Chorus, I looked after the construction sector for the organisation, and we did things like modular buildings, modular roofs, modular railway stations, so how you could add value to the steel that we were making. And then 15 years ago, I joined CPI as employee number 6, and since then we've been building an innovation centre for the UK that supports biotechnology, electronics, formulation, biological pharmaceuticals, and now small molecule pharmaceuticals, as well as materials like graphene and finally for healthcare photonics. And we've grown from those 6 people in those 15 years up to 450 people. We turn over about £35 million a year, and our asset base is not far off £200 million at replacement cost. So a significant growth. And along that journey, I also took some time out to be the High Value Manufacturing Catapult's first CTO, and I also wrote the original business plans for the High Value Manufacturing Catapult when it's created about 7 years ago. So I've been working in this innovation space now for probably 30 odd years, and that's culminated in a process we call the Innovation Integrator in CPI that allows organizations to work out whether they're in invention or in innovation or in commercialization, and what factors they need to address to move from where they are now to where they ideally want to be. So that's quite a long introduction, but I think that gives you a feel for my background in this innovation space. I have actually been a visiting professor in a couple of university departments as well, in resource efficiency and in construction. So I have a feel for both research and translation and innovation, I think.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate that journey because it puts you in a very good position to share with us the overarching challenges that the UK faces in translation of research. What would you say those are? Are they systemic? Are there core challenges that you've seen throughout the whole translation of research ecosystem?
I think they are probably systemic. I think the creation of the catapults, which was probably 7 or 8 years ago. Now, again, CPI predated that because it was created earlier by a regional development agency that knew that innovation was a challenge in its own region. But this understanding that innovations different from invention or discovery was a good thing by the UK. And they've supported that now continuously for 7-8 years, and there is funding in place for a few more years. And I think that's been a big step in the right direction. But there's still a huge opportunity, I think, to create a link between the universities. From a research point of view, I think they're very well funded, and I think they do brilliant work, and clearly that's shown in the citations and the publications that the UK produces. And a lot of the technology transfer offices also do good work as well, but I think that systematically as a country, we don't sit down and think, how are we going to get some of this fantastic research we've done into market, and so that it's creating value for the UK, but globally as well. And I think that the way you go about doing pure research and the way you go about doing invention and drawing in investment are actually quite different things. And being able to make those transitions and systematically understand how to do it is something that's a real challenge for the UK, which is we're beginning to scratch the surface of as we realise what it is. But we need to make sure that we continue to resource our research effectively, continue to resource our innovation support effectively, and now start thinking about how do we get that across that boundary from the university to the innovation centre to the market.
And obviously, one of the ways to continue supporting translation in the UK is to learn from success stories. Would you be able to share with us some of the highlights that can shed some light on how translation of research has improved in the last few years?
Whether these things are highlights or just a chat about those things is probably something that others need to decide about. But what CPI has is a group of very talented people who know how processes work, and they know how things translate from the laboratory into pilot manufacturing and then into main scale manufacturing. And we have a very active academic liaison group that works with about 40 universities in the UK at the moment. And we're doing projects for those universities that are about converting the university's idea or discovery into a process that works. And we also link those organisations to the potential external investors, private investors that could invest in them. So to pick out a couple of examples that are case studies that are available on CPI's website at the moment, one of those is Pragmatic Printing, which is an organisation that prints flexible logic chips. And they've been working with CPI for 7 or 8 years now and have done well over 10 projects with us, probably. And Pragmatic were a spin out originally from Manchester University, and they've worked closely with us through a range of different kinds of projects, both privately funded projects by themselves and also publicly private funded projects. So in the UK, things that you would classify as collaborative research and development programs that are Innovate UK funded with private match, and also some in what was called the Advanced Manufacturing Supply Chain Initiative, which allowed them as a very small SME to work with larger companies to test their projects and their process. So if you look at both Pragmatic's own website and the CPI case study that goes with it, you'll see that journey. And it's been very effective, and it's allowed them to be able to prove to investors that they're worthy of investment, and they've attracted significant amounts of money. And another one that is very current is a company called Callista, who are actually a Californian-based company. And what they do is they ferment methane into protein that they then make into a thing called feed kind, which is a fish food. And again, they came to us with research that was done, in Norway, their early stage research. And they brought that research to CPI because they'd selected CPI as an organization that could scale up their process. And first of all, we made a manufacturing process that worked in our labs at a relatively small scale, teacup size scale, if you like. And we've now scaled that up into a big continuous loop reactor that ferments the methane into the protein. And it's probably the first time that anything like this has been done on that particular scale in this particular way. And again, Callista, if you go and look on their website, have recently raised tens of millions of dollars to fund the investment in their first stage plants. So again, how do you link through and how do you find the people that you can work with that take you from this research, laboratory-based research base, through into this early stage piloting and on into a larger scale piloting is the kind of stuff that CPI does for people. And our feeling in CPI and in the High Value Manufacturing Catapult is there's significantly more opportunity to do that in the UK if we can establish the links and the funding mechanisms that can allow those things to happen. And those mechanisms have to be public-private mechanisms to make sure that the gap's bridged. Now, if we come on to things like Nexus and Maxwell, so Nexus is Leeds University's centre for allowing translation, basically. So it works with its own university to bring ideas that people have had for spin-out companies through, and they have laboratory space and office space and meeting space. And it's very early stage for them. They kicked off their work and they're bringing in a lot of those organizations. Now, as those organizations go through the Nexus space, they'll get to the point where they'll need to move out of that to scale to the next stage. And places like CPI or other parts of the Catapult network will be good places for them to go. I mean, equally, they might be able to do it privately as well, some of these companies, but having that Catapult system as well helps. So making that continuum and the university realizing that it has to focus its time and its effort on making this step happen is a real big move forward for them. And the Maxwell Centre in Cambridge is a similar kind of thing. It's attached mainly to the Cavendish laboratories, I think. And again, they have a number of spin-outs, but also a number of researchers all working in the same space. So it's a specific space which is about early stage translation and proving of processes. But I think the thing is that universities need to be more aware of this translation space and the fact that it is different from researching. So they need to create, I feel personally, these translation spaces, but also be aware that that's only a translation space. It has to go on to innovation or into market, and then it leaves the space. But having that continuum of pure research, early stage translation that combines research with first stage of business, and then later stage impact that can come through Catapult operation that can attract in larger scale private investment seems to be a good way forward for me. And I think that there are many more opportunities. I mean, Maxwell and Nexus aren't the only examples, but those are two that are at the front of my mind at the moment.
Do you see any significant sectoral or regional differences in the way that recent research translation can be supported and the pace at which it goes? Obviously, there is no blueprint.
That's a very interesting question. And firstly, let me say that having these specialists who know about it is quite important. And so impact work's been done on the High Value Manufacturing Catapult just recently, and that highlighted that people mainly came to the Catapult to access the expertise of the people. We had often had a feeling that it was about accessing the assets in the centres, but it isn't. Clearly it is, because if the assets weren't there, the centre wouldn't be able to do its work. But the thing that makes it valuable to the companies is these skilled specialist people. And I think that's true, that the translation centres are building that relationship as well, and then so are the innovation centres. And the other thing that the innovation centres were seen as contributing significantly to was helping companies teach their people how to do their jobs, if you like. So if it was a major company that was changing a process, it was a good, safe place for those people to come to learn how to operate the new process. And if they were an SME that was just kicking off its work, it was a way for the people to become experienced in how to operate the kit in that environment. So I think that's a really important point to make, and just to reiterate what you were saying about having these specialist groups of people who are good at this. And it is a special set of skills as well, and that need to be nurtured. Are there regional differences? I think we would say that there are differences between universities, and in certain circumstances there are differences between departments in universities. But I don't think it's easy to say that there are regional effects. I think one of the things that we observe in CPI is, because we're based in the northeast of England, a lot of people think we only serve the northeast of England, and in reality, that's a very small proportion of the companies that work with us. The majority of the companies that work with CPI are not in the northeast, and they're not necessarily even in the UK. So it's about that skill in innovation. So you could argue that in the process industry, the northeast is a centre of innovation. And equally, that will apply to the other centres within the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. that centre is a specific area where that technology is important. But that doesn't mean that the companies that work with that centre have to be located near to them. So it's difficult. I don't really know the answer to that, but I would say that we see different behaviours in different organisations, and we're very successful with people outside of region that know that they need innovation help, and they'll come into our region or into our facility to be able to do that. Having said that, on top of that, a lot of the centres in the High Value Manufacturing Catapult are now looking at how they can reach out into other regions, but that's more about how do you access the people that need innovation support rather than how do you make your centre bigger.
In all of your time and work in translation, are there any highlights in better ways or the ways that are good examples to stimulate understanding between industry and TTOs?
I'm not sure that I'm the best person to ask about that, but different people are skilled in different ways. So Imperial College have always been very successful, originally through Imperial Innovations and in how that they brought things through by specifically focusing on that activity. But equally, you would say that Durham University, who CPI works with a lot, are also very successful in it, but they use a slightly different model. And I think that the big opportunity for us is perhaps to identify all the best practices and see how those best practices are best applied, because clearly different universities research in different areas and research to different levels and research in different ways. So I think that's important. How do you get the benchmark, and how do you help all the different organisations that want this translation to happen do it to the best of their ability? I think the other thing that we often think is that it's about a relationship between the university directly to industry, and it isn't. It's more complicated than that. It's the research has to translate through the translation system into the innovation system, and for it to turn into a significant operation or a significant company or a significant organisation, it needs external private investment. So making the investors happy or confident enough to be able to invest is also part of this. And that translation, I mean, it really is translation from publicly funded research to public-private innovation through to private company, is something that we need to nurture and grow as much as we can, I think. So I haven't quite answered the question, but I have answered a question that I think is important.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Obviously, to understand and guide the practices of any organization within the translation of research ecosystem, there need to be some sort of metric. What are the metrics that you find have been useful?
I think the industry will measure, if it's going to turn into a company and go into market, it'll measure investment, asset, people employed, profitability, those kinds of things. But I think one of the things that people need to realize is it can take 10 years or more for a company to get to the point that it's reached where it's going, and it needs support and help along there. So measuring those things is important, but don't think that they're always going to be going in a positive direction, because if you've raised significant money from the private sector and you're investing in assets and people, the likelihood is you're not going to be profitable until those assets and those people are really performing, and it can take you 2 to 3 years to build your assets and to bed all those people in. So I think you need to measure metrics, but understand how those reflect on a growing company, particularly if it's a new one. So I think there are standard metrics that you can get from accounts and things, and there are companies like Bowhurst who map investment into spin outs and small SMEs and classify what kind of investment it is, and I think they can provide a huge amount of useful data. And then from our point of view within CPI, we have this process that we call the Innovation Integrator, and it looks at 11 factors that we think are necessary for an innovation to take hold. And they're things like supply chain, lead entrepreneur, people, regulator and legislator, money, to name about half of them. And we have a process that allows us, through basically an interviewing process, to assess where a company is. And what we'll do is we'll assess whether that company is in invention, in innovation, or in commercialization. And we'll say, this is the map. This is where you are against these 11 factors. And these are the factors that we believe that you need to address next. Now, in some cases, an organization like ours, like CPI's, will be able to help the company address those questions. In some cases, the company will need to do it itself. And in some cases, it will need to go to somebody that isn't CPI. But having that process that can turn qualitative data into quantitative data that the company can use, I think is quite important. And so I would say they're not really KPIs as such. We do tend to measure things like technology readiness levels and manufacturing readiness levels, but really, in the way we look at it, it's more about, are you inventing something? Are you turning that invention into something that somebody can use? And are you turning that something that somebody can use into a business? And that's the way we try to classify people. So I think metrics are very difficult here. And we do have models for measuring them, but it's so varied depending on the company and what the innovation is, that it's very difficult to say there are just 3 or 4 metrics that are the right metrics. And then finally, I think I'd say that in some cases we do work that tells companies not to do any more work and not go down that route. And I think giving them informed data that allows them not to follow routes that are going to be unsuccessful is quite an important thing. And again, you can't really measure that because you don't know when that's been a success or not, but it's an important part of the innovation process.
And innovation and translation of research, they don't happen in a vacuum. In the UK, it's very clear that there are people like yourselves who move across those boundaries between organizations and can share the knowledge. Can you speak to the importance of those mobile personas that can share knowledge and information across boundaries?
Yeah, I think these people that connect things are really important. And I think, even within Catapult centres, there are probably not that many people, but joining the dots up is something that a lot of people are talking about at the moment. And I think that is it. That people who have the experience and the knowledge to be able to spot the dots and how the dots join together to make something happen are people who are quite difficult to develop. And it's a skill base that we need to look out for, because joining things up, joining the money with the people with the idea to be able to solve something that's a market problem or a market need is a difficult thing to identify. So I think those people are vitally important. And I think the other thing that we're probably many of us are really well aware of is that the real opportunities lie on boundaries. They lie on boundaries between sectors, or they lie on boundaries between disciplines. And having people who are dedicated to looking across those boundaries and trying to identify the opportunities, and then have a set of models and metrics that allow them to judge whether what's going to be most successful is very important. And the next thing that's really important, even once you've done that, is having funding structures that can allow the support of those ideas to be able to move forwards. Because often, particularly in pure science, we fund in specific areas. We don't fund across boundaries. At the moment, being able to combine leading digital knowledge, for instance, Internet of Things knowledge, with technology bases, with market need, is a huge opportunity, isn't it, to create a new generation of value. But they're disciplines that don't necessarily fit together. And you can see the UK trying to do things through initiatives like Made Smarter to support these things. But it does need these people who can see and connect. I suppose if you think about organisations like the Royal Society with their entrepreneurs in residence and their fellowship programs, that's another way that you can support these things. And how you link these things, I keep saying things, all these activities up to be able to create value is something that, again, is worth further consideration, I feel.
Small, maybe not so small question. The REF. What effect does the Research Excellence Framework, the new one, 2021, have on translation of research?
I think it's moving in the right direction. There's much more emphasis on impact in this REF than there was on the last REF. And how you measure impact clearly is very difficult, because research comes in so many different ways, and social science is quite different from technology, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this understanding that impact is an important thing is a good addition to the REF. But I think we should probably spend more of our time and effort, obviously it won't happen in this REF, on how do you use the knowledge that you've created through all this publicly funded research to create value. And that's for me the next challenge. But I think we're kind of aware of it, and we're moving more towards impact. I think the danger is that we focus too much on the university as the thing that's going to do it, rather than creating an innovation system that can deliver value either to companies or to the nation.
And last but not least, do you see any potential conflict between open science and translation of research?
I suppose the obvious answer to that is that if you have open science and you publish everything you know, then it's very difficult to turn that into a business or a company or value that employs people and delivers something into a market. But I don't think the conflict's that massive in actual fact. I think if we go back to this thing about connectors and translation, then there are opportunities to identify where the value can be created and how the value can be created. So I don't think the UK should move away from its interest and its focus on open science. I think it should just do more thinking and supporting of how it creates value from that open science.
Thank you very much, Graham, for all of your insights and the time that you have shared with us.
It's my pleasure.